Hey, everybody. Welcome to Meet Someone Interesting. My name is Stephen Gunlock. I'm the pastor of congregational and group life here at City Church San Francisco. And in these online conversations, we are talking to a particular member of our City Church community who has a certain wisdom or experience to share with us. The hope here is that this is a time for us to try to stay connected while we're operating exclusively online by introducing you to someone who you might not know, but hopefully someday you will be able to know in real life. Also present here, present but unseen, is City Church's own Holy Ghost, Jason Morrell, who makes all of this possible. And as Kim and I begin to talk in a moment and questions start to come up for you, I invite you to go ahead and share those in the chat. Don't wait till later. And Jason's going to field those questions and ask them to Kim or I later on in our Q&A time. So getting down to business today, I am really excited to have Kim Watson with us to discuss the spirituality of midlife. To introduce the topic a little bit, we're going to be talking about the two halves of life, the first half being where we construct an identity. That phase is also often followed by a crisis where things tend to fall apart in some form or another in our life. In the words of Thomas Merton, it could be that we've climbed to the top of the ladder of our life only to realize that we've put the ladder up against the wrong wall. And then that's often followed by what can be referred to as the second half of life, in which we are invited to live into a deeper and truer and more spiritually attuned place to really live out of our own soul, so to speak. So Kim and her husband, I see the questions are already coming in. That's great. Kim and her husband, Terry, were a part of City Church in its very earliest days before leaving and traveling around the world for a number of years, I believe most recently living in the UK. And they returned to us 3 years ago, having lived a lot of life and having experienced a great deal of change. And they returned to a City Church that had also experienced its own midlife journey. Kim wrote her master's dissertation on the midlife journey and co-leads a group that also goes by that name. So I literally can't imagine a better person to be having this conversation with right now. So welcome, Kim. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks. Nice introduction.
Thank you. Well, it's fun to get to talk with you. I think when we were talking, a good segue into the overall topic for folks, I think, would be to get to hear some of your story of what led you down this path, what led you into this work and study. What was the the crisis, so to speak, or the turning point that that landed you where you are?
It still kind of makes me laugh to realize that this is what kind of has come to define the second half of my life, because I think if you had asked me 10 or 12 years ago, would I make a study of something with the word liminal in it? I wouldn't have known what I was talking about. I grew up in the church. I grew up in the evangelical church. I was had a little evangelist heart given to me by my mother, and worked for non-denominational Christian ministries, and went to City Church in its earliest days when it was very, traditional evangelical church. And then life just happens. And I think in our culture, we don't really mark transitions very much. I realized that when I was in my early 30s, I got married and then had 3 kids. I realized that was a transition, but I don't think we give people the tools to kind of think more broadly, what is happening in my life right here. And I think the first half of life is just busy. You've got lots going on. There's a lot of things you have to get done in the first half of life. You have to pay your own way. Your parents eventually cut you off, and you have to, you have to partner up, or you have to create chosen family. You have to choose your hobbies and vote, and all these adulting type tasks take tons of time and energy. And sometimes we make a choice and then you don't realize that you just keep going down that path. And I think what happened to me is that because I am energetic and it's sort of insatiable for experiences. I'm an Enneagram 7, if that means anything to anybody. So
it's the enthusiast.
Yes, I'm the enthusiast who avoids suffering by activity. So anyway, I think what happened is midlife kind of snuck up on me. And there are some old souls in my life. I see one on the chat there. I won't mention her name, but she does like to cook a lot, and it was in my CG. But there's those people who start to question what's going on in their life a lot younger than I did. So when we moved to London in 2009, I was 49 years old, and I would never have said that I was in any kind of transition or liminal space. And I would have said I had a lot going on.
Let's define it, because I think we're going to use the word a lot. Liminal space being, the space of change. Is that correct? Or the unknown?
Yeah, limen, the word limen, Limen, actually means threshold. So the mental picture that goes with the word limen is the threshold of a door. And I really love pictures of doors as a result. And if you've ever been to any ruins anywhere, usually you end up with a wall someplace that has a door. And I normally think that you take a picture of that when you're on holiday, whatever place you're in where you see an old place like that, because it's dividing old and new. But anyway, the concept of limen is this threshold, and it's the feeling and the sense, and this is what the mystics and the Celts talked about. Liminal space is a space on the threshold. You cannot go back to where you came, and there's this kind of mysterious part where you're walking through to the next thing. But what makes it liminal is that you don't know what the next thing is. So I think that COVID is a type of liminal space. Yeah. And I don't like to overuse the word and, like liminal chapstick, it would be trivializing it. But I do think that this is a very much, when you have something cataclysmic, either in your life or in your world, and it changes the way things are, and you can't go back, or you can't see how you could go back, but you're not sure what's going to happen. And you feel a bit lost, maybe excited, maybe you're so happy not to be where you were that you're open to it. But a lot of times it's really kind of disorienting. And I think that you don't usually realize you're there until something kind of triggers it. And for me, it had been sort of from about 45. So the 5 years before that had kind of a steady drip of sort of challenges that I had to face, and that took all my 7 energy and willpower. Parenting, my kids were coming to adolescence. It was adolescent parenting in our house took on some epically difficult proportions. And it's not really my story to tell, but I will say it was epically hard. So my dad and my mom died 4 years apart, way too young, in their early 70s, or at about, my dad was 70. And, I planned the funeral. I gave an address. I make people laugh. I let people cry. I'm always on. And so I never really I didn't really do soul care outside of the very traditional, evangelical Christian, I don't know, have a quiet time or go to church. I didn't have any tools that we offer now at City Church. Anyway, between parenting and losing my parents, and then there was a giant recession, and Terry got unemployed in it for a year. So then that was stressful financially. And then I'm not sure, I think the kids and I, and Terry, who's English, decided, well, if he's going to be unemployed, maybe we should just have an adventure while he looked for a job. And so we picked the most disorienting thing you could do, which is to change countries with a 14 and a 16-year-old. And they were up for it. But then we moved to London, and it was good and it was hard and it was, exciting and Instagrammable, but it was also disorienting and finding a new church. And then I went through sort of a big faith shift, sort of simultaneous to City Church, around some traditional views of evangelical Christianity, primarily around LGBTQ inclusion. Mm-hmm. But other doctrines as well that evangelism, hell, having to always prove with apologetics that my religion was better than everybody else's, and that Muslims and every other religion or people of no religion had no sense of the divine, like it was the exclusive property of Protestant Christians. So anyway, it was just kind of a cumulative thing. And I didn't think I realized I was in liminal space but I was getting cranky. So when a 7 is off kilter, they get cranky and judgy and up themselves, self-critical and short-tempered and I don't know, cynical. It just wasn't the best side of me that I was kind of always balancing. It felt like I didn't like myself, and I know some people didn't like me at the time. I felt abrasive. And so anyway, somebody handed me this book. It's my actual original copy. I have them laying all around the house.
Nice.
It's called Following Upward by Richard Rohr.
Everyone should read it.
Everybody should read it. You should read it when you're in the first half of life, so you know what you're doing, so that when you wake up. Anyway, so somebody handed me that book, and that's where my journey began.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing all of that. There's a few things that I feel like I'm hearing that are themes around this two halves of life for the midlife journey, but it seems like a big one is, at least what I'm hearing from your story, is leaving something, a country or a place, or losing something, or a crisis at home, a crisis in, it could be a number of things, but there's leaving something in a sense that your tribe that you've been in, all of a sudden you don't even really know how, it just doesn't fit anymore. And you just, what I'm hearing is that it sounds like you just sort of like woke up in that, in a sense.
So a lot of these themes, yes, very much so, especially around faith. That would have been the case. Very few people want to do the work of midlife, of doing what we do in the group that lasts for 9 months, or making a deep dive, reading the Richard Rohr book and some other ones in the bibliography that I made, unless usually something pushes you. If you're content, if you're, there are people, and they're perfectly nice people, but people who don't have to suffer a lot of failure in their life, who everything goes well, like they never struggle financially, and their kids grow up and turn out perfect and accept all their values and call home. Yeah. And if you don't have failure to reckon with, Richard Rohr says failure. That's why he says falling upward. He said, unless you realize where you're falling, you'll never move up. It's okay to fall, but that is just so not the message that I got in the faith I was raised in and the culture I was raised in America. Like, embracing failure is not a thing. So yes, a lot of times it could be something that's really normal and not that bad. Like your last child goes to college, or you retire, or something happens that gives you some space. And some people, it's just a gentle transition, and they realize before they jump, when they've retired, before they jump into something, perhaps they should create some space in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that sense of creating. What we ask people to do is to not, I think we tend to flail around when we're unhappy. We look for something that will really fast make us feel better.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard Rohr would say that sometimes the feeling bad is the thing that's going to help you feel good again.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You have to stay in that space.
Yeah. Social scientists actually say that everybody's unhappy at some point between 40 and 60, like really unhappy. Like, why did I go to all this trouble to work this hard to get this? And it generally kind of goes away when things get a little bit easier. But that's different than what the opportunity we have to take more of an intentional look in our 40s or 50s, or maybe even our early 60s to ask some really important questions.
Yeah. So what was that like for you, finding yourself in a space of agitation or antsiness, of feeling like certain things aren't working anymore? How did you go about what I'm imagining, and we talked a little bit about this when we talked a few days ago, but the process of figuring it out, like figuring out what the steps were that you needed to take, figuring out what you needed to let go of and what you needed to add in. What was that like for you in that the liminal space, you know?
I mean, there was a year in there that was really so bad parenting wise that, you know, I really just clung on. So there wasn't a group or a tool that was really there. But what did happen was that, I mean, I had a friend who was safe enough to walk with once a week, and we could lament together, basically. And it was totally confidential. And she didn't really think I was going to go home and run away from my family and leave them. You know, it's like, but I was safe enough to say, oh, what if I wasn't married anymore? Or what if I, you know, just like the worst thoughts you could have, I could say them out loud. So I did have one friend. And then I just started reading, and I slowly but surely started dropping things. You know, so I'd always taught Bible studies because I'm perky and I can stand up in front and come up with a good story. But I wasn't sure what I wanted to communicate from the Bible anymore. And I was also waking up and really realizing that, like, misogyny really was a thing. and I could admit that and feel that pain. So, you know, as an Enneagram 7, the first thing you do when you're really miserable is you look for somebody else to blame. So that's one of our favorites.
It's not just 7s.
Okay. Well, it's a kind of superpower for us.
Yeah. Okay.
So, you know, I could blame the church, and I could blame my parents, and I could blame lots of things. But it was really a slow process for me. There weren't really very many tools besides this well-thumbed copy of the Midlife Falling Upward. But I read a lot of a guy named James Hollis, who's a Jungian psychologist who writes and is probably the Jungian psychologist that really covers this material in depth. And I just realized, and Jung, I actually read a lot of Jung, and I realized that I wasn't crazy and that I needed to do some work. At the same time, that's about the same time somebody introduced me to the Enneagram, which, you know, there's many tools, and the Enneagram's super popular right now. I thought it was maybe kind of a satanic symbol when I first saw it, you know, then.
I can see it behind you there.
Yeah, I got one on my door because I'm in.
Is that okay? Is that allowed? No, just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, it's my Enneagram door. Anyway, so what was great was finding some people outside of my tribe. So one of the things we talk about in midlife, the Catholics have these 3 fancy words called purgation, illumination, and union. And it's the mystics use these words, and they talk about any kind of process where we want to get someplace better. You go through a season of purgation. It's sort of the dark night of the soul. It's feeling like God isn't there. Maybe you're not there. You don't know what's happening. And you go back and you look at some of the things that have influenced you. Like I kept moving with Terry, and thus I would have these somewhat jobs sometimes, but I didn't really work very much. Most of the time my kids were at home. Then I realized I had a lot of conflicted emotions I had never processed. Like in my mind, I was a career woman, climbing a ladder of something. And so like honestly evaluate. And I find I was giving weird advice to young mothers saying, don't quit your job, don't quit your job. I'm thinking, wow, I'm like living my life through them. I need to think about this. Quit your job, don't quit your job. So I had to go back and see how a choice I made one time because we moved became a choice I made and had some good and had some hard. And life is not black and white. Not every decision that you make is either a good decision or a bad decision. God did not tell you, God doesn't make very much of a habit of saying, I really want you to get this job versus that job. I mean, there's all these ways that life is not black and white. So you do purgation. And then once you kind of get rid of all the crap that's on the outside of yourself, all this ego and personality, you can take a little bit of a look at who you really are and you illumine yourself. And then eventually you come to a more holistic spot of union with God, but with also yourself. And people who do this work become our wise elders. Like, I wouldn't say yet I've achieved wise elderhood, but I would say that I'm a lot more likely to someday be that kind of elder in a community that can laugh at herself, can embrace mystery, can love people on the margins. I think wise elders want to be on the margins. They don't need to dance on the stage anymore. They don't need to be the life of the party all the time. So Richard Rohr calls it disorder. He calls it order, disorder, reorder in a lot of his teaching. So he'll say, you find yourself in a place of disorder, and then you need to reorder. You need to order, and then you have this period of disorder, and then you reorder into a self that maybe is more true to who you really are inside.
Yeah, and it sounds like part of the reordering involves oftentimes looking outside of where you are, or maybe even looking outside of the things that you've been told would have all the answers.
100%. 100%. So in the same way that City Church was starting to take a look at itself and its rigidity in its theology and what it offered up for ways, I mean, back in the day, don't tell anybody this.
This is live, Kim. Just
yeah. Well, I want to sell Fred and Terrell. Oh no. We had like a parenting book, and then we got the guy to come and speak, and we all it was like if we all did it this way, it was all going to work out. Yeah. And none of the people of that generation, it absolutely 100% didn't work out.
For every single one.
We could not make our children be anything, that we wanted to impose on them, and we shouldn't have wanted to, So that's what's kind of funny. So so we often talk about what happens in the first half of life is you're really busy doing, and sometimes some of yourselves have to get neglected. And it's one thing if you neglect them and you just say, I'm a marathon runner, but I have a full-time job and 3 children and my mother's ill, so I'm not going to be training, running 100 and whatever miles a week. I don't, but you still know inside that you're a marathon runner, but you just can't do it right there. Other selves of ours really get neglected. We entirely forget about them. And so midlife is a time you'll see people. I must have 3 or 4 friends that paint now, not just paint, but paint well. And found parts of themselves that they'd never known were there. And for me, I don't think I'd forgotten it. If you'd asked me if I was good in school, I would have said, yeah, I was great in school. I was always a straight A student. But I dropped out of a master's program when I had too much going on. It was at a seminary. I dropped out of seminary after about a year and a half of what would have been a master's, not an MDiv. But I didn't try to switch it to MDiv. I didn't want to get the master's. I just stopped. I was pregnant and breastfeeding at the same time and working full time, and I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. So I just stopped, and I never went back. It never worked out. And then I had this giant sort of faith shift, and I thought, well, what parts, or I had the faith shift, and I was looking for my neglected selves. And one of them was like to be a student again. But I kind of wanted to go back and finish that, even though I was super annoyed with my own faith tradition. I'm getting better at, like Ken Wilber says, including, the good parts of youth culture, but being firm that some of those parts were really bad that I had to digest around women or sexuality, or some of it it needs to get off the menu. But other ways, my upbringing and some organizations I was involved with, really gave me a base of love and inclusion and grounding. So anyway, that's when I went and signed up to do this master's in Christian leadership, which is definitely the dumbest name for a master's ever. But it's England, and it's just like a Narnia book or a C.S. Lewis book. You actually take like 5 classes total. You can kind of pick them. And then you spend a year reading like 1 million pages and producing a 100-page dissertation at the end. And so I went and I said, well, here, this is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in Celtic spirituality, liminal space, midlife, what can happen to people in there, what opportunities they have. And they said, well, it's a master's, not a PhD. So you have to on to somebody who's already done work. You have to, you can add to it your thoughts, but really this is a base. So I said, okay. Is Richard Rohr right? And they went, oh, he's kind of a Catholic heretic. And I'm like, I know, but I think everything he says is brilliant here. And that's where
but that's what I like.
Anyway, it was seminary, so there were plenty of people who were outside the main box. And that's what I did. Basically, I said, is Richard Rohr right? And it was the best thing I ever did, because like as a 7, my growth path and the neglected part of myself that's key is my 5. So I stopped leading anything but my inner.
Can you say what the 5 is real quick?
The 5 is the investigator and the observer.
Okay. Yeah.
So the 5 is the person who loves to gain knowledge and translate it into wisdom for others. And 5s tend to have a lot of boundaries. They like a lot of time alone. These are not things that you would have thought about a 7. And then I found them in my midlife journey. I think you find these neglected parts of yourself. And for me, it was the part that could read and write, and I used a lot of poetry in it. And so, and then I showed it to my friend Lisa Kirch-Gessner over at Common Table. And she'd been doing some similar work. And so that's when we started our group that's now finished 3 years.
Nice. Yeah. Well, that's so that's so cool to hear about, though, the letting go of things, and then the returning to neglected part of yourself, trying to figure out what from the past to include, what was that good thing that I had in the midst of a lot of bad things. That's just incredible work. And it's really cool to hear how this played out in your life. For folks watching, a quick reminder that we will go to Q&A eventually. So if you haven't asked any questions yet, please go ahead and add those to the chat. Jason Morrell is here. I can see him. You can't. I really can't see him. He's here, and he is fielding the anything going on in there. I can't actually see right now if anything's going on in there. But if there's not, we invite you to start asking those. But Kim, I had a few questions for you, and one of which we talked about a little bit the other day is a question that I think comes up a lot, particularly for, maybe people in their 20s and 30s, or maybe into their 40s, of the idea being like, can part of your life be second half and the other part first half? A group I'm thinking of in particular is in the queer community, and it's certainly been a big part of my experience. There's, especially if you grow up in a conservative church, you are quickly jettisoned into a second half of life, spirituality or a different kind of Christianity. But other parts of your life might still be very first half. You might even be behind in, marriage, long-term partnerships, things like that. So that's just something I think about in light of this conversation is, can part of me really be second half of life and part of me really be first half at the same time?
Yes. Partly because what you're experiencing when you get thrust into a no man's land, like fully embracing queerness but having a family of origin and a faith tradition of origin or other things. So you'll absolutely. So first of all, I'd say liminal space happens to us throughout our life. We're only in one, for people in the middle of life, between the two halves of life, that's just one type of liminal space. And it is interesting because, it kind of comes at a time when there tend to be a lot of converging factors. You can't run as fast or cycle as fast as you used to. So you've got some physical things. I mean, Carl Jung will push midlife people to say, unless you really wrestle with the idea of death, you're really not going to live the second half freely, because all you're doing is denying that you're going to die by these adaptive behaviors, because death is scary.
Yeah.
And Richard Rohr says really clearly that those people who suffer, either through their own failures or through suffering that is totally not their own fault, certainly racism, trauma in your family of origin, any kind, any health issues. Nobody survives cancer as a young adult or a teenager or and is the same as their peers. You're just not going to be the same as your peers, because it's going to affect you and it's going to give you a wisdom, a hard-earned wisdom that your peers don't have. So yes, I think people who suffer, people who are excluded, will absolutely be learning a kind of wisdom that the world is not black and white. And they still could need to get a job and find, a roommate and do those things. So yes, absolutely. Suffering brings on a kind of growth. That said, Ken Wilber would say, and there's a very famous book that you have to read in seminary if you're doing anything around congregational life and development, by this guy named James Fowler, and he talks about the stages of life. So you can't jump from like stage 2 to stage 5. You've got to go through. There's another really great book. I see somebody asking for a book suggestion in the comments. But there's another book called The Critical Journey that from the Christian tradition. And she talks about the stages of faith one goes through. And you start when you're a child and you take on hook, line, and sinker your parents' faith. You're just part of a faith community. Mm-hmm. And then you end up learning the tenets of the faith slightly separate from your parents. And then you go through adolescence and young adulthood. And ideally, you are encouraged to investigate and choose for yourself, not just go to college and find the exact kind of church that you left there. Your mom finds it for you and then gets you joined up before you even go to college. So the stages of faith.
As someone who sometimes receives those emails from those moms, I've never seen any of your children at City Church.
Right.
So.
I sat through some really boring services and in colleges with really drunk young adults who are only there so that they could continue to get their allowance. So yes, children need to go through that, and young adults need to go through that stage of faith. And then usually there's some kind of crisis of faith that happens, that where you kind of hit a wall. In the critical journey, she talks about it as a wall. And this often coincides. By the time you get there, you're 40-ish or older. So I think, some types of personality will see these things coming and be able to identify that they're feeling out of sorts a bit in their inner being. A person like me, who is always having fun and making life really fun, and I could ignore it for a number of years until it was kind of like leaking out of me in ways like bitterness or sarcasm, or I've always liked to cuss, but I was really cussing a lot then. Yeah. And because I had sort of unprocessed anger, and so sideways. I had to. That's why we the first year we made it optional, and now in the third year of the midlife group, if you're not interested in sort of learning the Enneagram as a tool for processing how you build an ego exterior, that's your first half of life, versus finding your true self down there, then you probably wouldn't want to join the group, because you would just, it would just be awful, because you'd have to keep hearing it all the time. But for me, that really saved my life, because you stand inside your own personality and you view the world from it. And so you think you're thinking like in a way that's objective, like everybody thinks like this. You don't realize that you think like other sevens, but then you have your own other thoughts. So I didn't realize how much a seven panics at the thought of failure, or of not having the ability to fix a problem. Like, I can fix anything if I let myself try. I want to fix everything. So I had to learn to let some of that go. But that was terrifying. So, but you would have never known. If you had come to London, I would have taken you to the most fun pubs. If you're a cyclist, I would have taken you on the most fun road bike ride. I would have gotten tickets for a great thing. So you wouldn't have known that some of this internal processing was going on.
I think that's probably true for a lot of people, that we can go through a very high functioning crisis of sorts. So it's 7:41, and I'm having, for some reason, my Facebook feed, I can't have it on my iPad. I can't see if people are asking questions. So I'm just going to hand it over to Jason. I've definitely got some more, but do we have any questions yet, Jason?
I can see the Skype question there. Somebody
let's read. Okay, so let's read the question, because I'm not sure if people can see
what happens. So the first question: what are the 3 books you would recommend for people who are sensing they are bumping up against the second half of life? So first and foremost, I would suggest reading Falling Upward by Richard Rohr. It's a great book, and so that's what I would do first. Second of all, I would email me, and Jason, you can put my email in there. It's kimpwatson@gmail.com. I could give you a copy of the dissertation I wrote, which City Church graciously spiral binds. And I can get a few more copies of that. And then I can also send it to you in a digital Dropbox PDF form if you're a digital reader. And at the back of that, I have a super extensive bibliography of books and writers. So certainly anything James Hollis has written, if you're a person who's interested in psychology. I also really, really recommend people to back off of the nonfiction guilting yourself as you're going into the second half of life, because I think we are don't stop reading the books on racism, because that's important, and we're right now at a crisis point where we can do something. But I think part of my problem was I was always trying to read the serious stuff to fix myself. And when I found myself, Mary Oliver poems probably did more for me at the beginning of this journey than anything else. So poetry we really include in our group. So I would encourage you to read memoirs. Sue Monk Kidd wrote a memoir called When the Heart Waits, and she talked about her sort of journey through the middle of life. It's a beautifully written book. But I would, that's what I would do. I would read, I'd get like some, you know what? I think my favorite book ever at that time was Padraig Ochuma's book, In the Shelter, Finding a Place in the World. Now, he was a very young man who wrote that book, but talk about an old soul. He was probably an old soul at 10.
Yeah, it seems that way.
So that's another book, In the Shelter, and read it slowly. Read it one chapter at a time, and then wait a day or two and read another chapter. Don't read it in a weekend. So that's a lovely book.
I feel like a lot of, I just wanted to point, I feel like I'm hearing a lot of you saying, read things that are going to cause what's inside of you to kind of come to the surface rather than looking for the external answer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because one of the things I did, and everybody's a little bit different, but I had incorporated all these ideas of what it meant to be a good person. And thus I was only really allowed to cultivate those areas of my life. And everything else was just the fluff, So, it was, when I went to the mountains and got in nature, that was like something I did when I wasn't being a good Christian. It's taken me forever to know that my spirituality is extremely nature-based.
Yeah.
And that the construction of my personality kind of started to falls away much better walking in the woods than it does reading another self-improvement book, even an enneagram book. So somebody else asked a question that says, what happens if a person rejects moving into the midlife journey?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, and you can't make them. You just really have to leave them alone until it happens for them. When people join the midlife group, if they're married and their partner doesn't join the group, we warn excessively against, like, this is for you. Do your thing. They'll watch. It may even be hard for them. A lot of times we've taken on a role that everybody really likes us to do. If you're an Enneagram 2 and you've been helping your family and enabling everything in the family, and all of a sudden you wake up and you're like, you know what? I don't know why I feel like I have to help everybody all the time. And you stop helping. Mm-hmm. People aren't going to like it at first. And that's like, I'm not a psychologist. I think that's sort of family systems, how families work. But you get assigned a role very young. And then if you create your own family, you get a role over there too. And sometimes you're bouncing back because you got one role in your family, and then you go back to your family of origin and you're back in, like, I'm the fixer, I'm the safety guy, I'm the whatever. So you're bouncing these roles, and you've got to take some time to say, wow, what roles do I have? And do I really want to keep that role? And then when you deconstruct, relationships can be hard for a while.
Yeah, because there's a lot of pressure to stay in those roles, and it's not intentional. But it's very disruptive to start to change those things. But also it's probably the best thing we can do in the long run for those we love.
Yeah. Some relationships, if you do good work at any stage of life to accept yourself for who you are, to embrace some parts of yourself that you put to the side because you thought they weren't acceptable selves, you may lose some relationships. Mm-hmm. And that might happen. And you might move on from some, and that's okay. It can be a little hard. I always say, and I think probably anybody who's going through a big change in life, find the people who are safe to talk to. And then you don't need to tell everybody, but I've had it happen both ways. Like, I had a young man once tell me he was worried about his parents because they weren't going to church very often, and they were doing all these sort of new things, and they like joined some other kind of group, but they weren't, and he was worried that they were falling away from their faith or something. And I'm like,
the
well,
reverse of what normally happens.
Like to do, and I'm like, he described them. I'm like, I think your parents are fine. I think your parents are in the second half of life, and they're good. They're finding themselves in new ways. And no, they may not be teaching Sunday school, and your dad may not want to be on the finance committee anymore. But that's okay. Like that's okay. And and I think there's a certain grief if you see your parents are doubling down on things. But all you can do, I think, on any way in living is live your best life and live it in front of people, and then hope they see. But lecturing and prescribing, I still like to try to do that. But other people, my adult kids and stuff, I have lots of great advice for them. But there's another question 3. It says, was there much overlap with your liminal space journey and your husband's?
That's a good one.
And how did you process that phrase together and or separately? So we were lucky. My husband's a little bit older than me. So he retired sort of in that time. And so he had his own really crappy year or two that were separate from mine, that I couldn't put my finger on that he was unhappy. And I think he would have said he was happy because he chose to retire, but he wasn't seeming very happy. So we both had kind of a muddled series of years there. And he didn't read everything I did, but he did proofread this dissertation a number of times. And he's a good writer, and he has the Oxford degree, which I wish I had remembered to go to Oxford in England. But and he really loved James Hollis, and he just this Christmas asked for on his list of books a book that Richard Rohr had suggested on somebody who was sort of a Jungian scholar who wrote about the shadow side of ourselves, and that's of course a big thing. So it's not been exact, but I have been lucky that he didn't just double down on we have to be the same. Our journey, our faith journey, which is too much, we're too close to the end, that somebody can email me if they want to, but sort of our leaving the church we had joined in London. One of my crises was I joined a church in London that was still not inclusive, even though I had been moving that direction. And I needed to figure out why do I keep doing these things? Why am I like a moth to the flame of evangelicalism? I have a gay sister who I adore, and I wouldn't even bring her to my own church. I would send her to another church. So I was doing these really bizarre things. Anyway, I had to sort it out. I had to think a long time. I had to read books, and I had to be transformed, and I had to so I will just segue. So there's another question on here that says, is your love for cooking connected to your second half of life journey? And I would say that I've always loved cooking and made, good healthy meals. And it wasn't something I didn't like to do. And I grew up in a cookie family. But I would say that giving myself permission to, that it's one of my neglected selves. Because there are a lot of years there with, when you're busy and you're working, and I did end up quitting working, but you're still busy and you got kids and sports and stuff. And I had 3 kids in 3 years. And, I steamed a lot of broccoli there for a while. And I may never eat, maybe if I have grandkids someday, I'll eat steamed broccoli again. But the part of being able to love plants and nature and cooking and food and spices and health is definitely something that once I stopped leading Bible studies, I could create a table-based lifestyle that's so much better with my personality. Like my mom, I somehow thought that working with desperately poor people all the time on a day-to-day basis would be the best way to be a Christian. And I'm so poorly suited to that by my personality, but nobody ever told me that I could pick a job or a volunteer work that was different. I could be a mentor or a coach instead of I ran a food bank for a year, which was super fun to set up in London. But running a food bank and was not fun after it started for an Enneagram 7. It was really hard and sad. And so getting a lot of volunteers to do it and finding somebody who loved that kind of work to take it over, and then raising a bunch of money so it had money, that was really good in my personality. And I didn't have to love to do all the other stuff. That was okay. Yeah. So cooking's connected to that. And also we haven't been able to do it really much in COVID, but we have really I think at a certain point, I really couldn't do anything churchy at all in London, except for to have Tuesday night dinners. And they were super eclectic. It was all the queer people, not all of them, because many were still in the closet in this non-affirming church, but it was queer people, my neighbors, some young people who were really questioning, who are already a bit of old souls. It was really eclectic. So that's yes, food in my second half of life and feeding people is big for me.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear about. We're getting kind of close to time. I don't know, Jason, are there any other questions in the chat? That's it. I think, I guess, is there anything else, Kim? I feel like we've, covered a huge amount of territory, and this has been really great, but is there anything else that you feel like you wanted to say to folks this evening before we wrap up? Oh.
It would have been really, really, really hard at other stages of my life. And it was and has been difficult some days, but more because I feel for people who are suffering. I think one of the great things about finding some of my neglected selves is that I can have some time for them. I can, I can read more. I've read more novels this spring, and I've done things. So I have, as things have loosened up, I've found workarounds, around. I have a deck in San Francisco behind my apartment. And so I've had used some of my gifts that way. But overall, like many people, I thought more about what can this teach me when I am a person who doesn't slow down very well. What are my choices about slowing down? Am I going to fight it, or am I going to go into isolation, knowing the best thing I could do for the world is not get sick, which seemed like kind of a low bar, but if that's the best thing I can do is stay healthy, I'll do that, and then I'll find other ways. I can work Zoom now. But, but even then, I didn't get frantically busy on Zoom. Like many people, I have taken it as a bit more of a contemplative space. One of our adult children is working from home too, and I'm fully aware that this is sort of working from my home as opposed to her tiny apartment in Manhattan. And I'm keenly aware that it's an experience I might, never have again with my kids. So I've been trying to be patient in that too.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Kim, thank you so much for being with us here. I've really enjoyed talking to you tonight and the past few days. I'm sure all the folks out there have really, really gotten a lot out of this and a lot out of your journey so far. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. And I think we can imagine that there are tons of applause going on in homes right now. So, but it was great, and thank you so much. And thank all of you for tuning in. I guess I use words like that now. Yeah. And we'll look forward to keep finding ways to connect with you. With that, good night.
Good night.